In 1930, a man opened a small shop on a quiet street in Leicester. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to help his neighbors. By the time his grandchildren were running the business, Wilko had grown into something no one had planned for. 400 stores across Britain, from Cornwall to Glasgow. Millions of families walked through those doors every single week, not for anything glamorous, for washing up liquid, for light bulbs, for seeds to plant in the back garden, for the small, necessary things that hold a life together. Wilko didn't sell luxury, it sold dignity. Then in the summer of 2023, it was gone. Not slowly, not quietly. In less than 90 days, every single store closed. 12,500 people lost their jobs. And hundreds of high streets across Britain were left with a gap. Physical, visible, and still unfilled. How does a shop that served this country for 93 years simply vanish? And what does it say about the Britain we are living in now? That is the story this film tells. Leicester, 1930. This was not a wealthy city, it was a working city. Textile mills, shoe factories, long shifts, and longer weeks. The people who lived here did not have much to spare, but they had homes to keep, families to feed, and a quiet, stubborn pride in doing things properly, even when money was tight. James Kemsey Wilkinson understood that world. He had grown up inside it. In 1930, at the age of 19, he opened a small hardware shop on Charnwood Street. The shelves were stocked with the kind of things people actually needed. Brushes, cleaning products, basic tools, household essentials. Nothing decorative, nothing aspirational, just useful, honest goods at a price that did not require a second thought. There was no grand vision written down anywhere, no investor pitch, no 5-year plan. There was simply a young man who looked at his community and saw a gap between what people needed and what they could reasonably afford, and decided to fill it. That instinct, modest as it sounds, would turn out to be the foundation of everything. What made Wilkinson's shop different from the other stores on the high street was not the range of products, and it was not the decor. It was the feeling inside the door. Department stores in the 1930s could be intimidating places. High ceilings, formal displays, the quiet suggestion that you should perhaps be better dressed before entering. Wilkinson's was nothing like that. It was small, practical, and completely without pretension. The staff knew the customers by name. The prices were marked clearly. You came in, you found what you needed, you left without feeling as though you had been looked down upon. For working-class families in the Midlands, that mattered more than any window display. James ran the shop himself through the difficult years of the 1930s and the war years that followed. It did not make him rich, but it kept the doors open, and it kept its customers loyal, not through promotions or advertising, but through the simple, repeated act of being reliable. When his son Tony joined the business after the war, something shifted. The post-war years in Britain were years of cautious optimism. Families were rebuilding. People wanted their homes to feel like homes again. The demand for affordable household goods, good quality, sensibly priced, was quietly growing. Tony Wilkinson saw what his father had built, and he saw what it could become. The expansion that followed was not dramatic. There were no announcements, no fanfare. Just one new store, then another, each one planted in a working town, on a working high street, serving the same kind of customer that James had served on Charnwood Street in 1930. The philosophy never changed, even as the business grew. Value for money, not cheap, not flashy, not trying to be something it was not. There is something quietly remarkable about a family business that holds on to its original instinct across 4 generations. Most companies drift. They are acquired, rebranded, repositioned. The original idea gets buried under layers of strategy and restructuring until it is almost unrecognizable. Wilko never did that. For better and for worse, it remained, to the very end, the shop that James Kemsey Wilkinson had opened on a quiet street in Leicester, 93 years before. The name above the door changed over time, shortened from Wilkinson's to Wilko as the brand modernized. But the idea underneath it did not change at all. A shop for ordinary people, honest goods, fair prices, No nonsense. It sounds simple, and in some ways it was. But what that simplicity built, the trust, the habit, the quiet place Wilko came to occupy in British life, was anything but ordinary. There is a particular kind of Saturday morning that anyone who grew up in Britain between the 1970s and the 2000s will recognize immediately. The car park behind the high street, the smell of exhaust and fresh air mixed together, a parent taking a child by the hand, a list in a pocket, washing powder, light bulbs, a new mop head, something for the garden. Nothing exciting, nothing to look forward to by any reasonable measure. And yet, there was something about walking into Wilko that felt, in its own quiet way, entirely right. The lighting was bright and functional. The aisles were narrow and packed floor to ceiling. The floor was hard and the trolleys were slightly awkward, and there was always someone blocking the cleaning products aisle with a very large basket. None of that mattered. What mattered was the feeling that everything you needed was here, in one place, at a price you did not have to worry about. That feeling, reliable, unpretentious, completely without drama, was the golden era of Wilko, and it lasted for decades. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Wilko expanded steadily across England, Wales, and Scotland. Not into shopping centers or out-of-town retail parks. Wilko stayed on the high street, in the middle of town, where it had always been. New stores opened in Nottingham, Sheffield, Birmingham, Cardiff, Glasgow. Each one looked more or less the same. Each one served more or less the same customer. That consistency was not an accident, it was the whole point. You could walk into a Wilko in Sunderland and find exactly what you would have found in a Wilko in Bristol. Same shelves, same layout, same prices, same cheerful red branding on the bags. For a country that was changing rapidly in almost every other way, there was something genuinely comforting about that. Wilko did not follow fashion. It did not reinvent itself every few years. It simply remained what it was. And people came back, week after week, because of it. The range of products Wilko stocked in its peak years was, in hindsight, quietly extraordinary. Cleaning products, garden tools, pet supplies, stationery, party decorations, paint, batteries, candles, picture frames, seed packets, Christmas decorations sold at prices that seemed almost impossible. Own brand washing up liquid that worked just as well as the name brands and cost half the price. None of it was glamorous. All of it was necessary. And woven through all of it was a particular kind of British domestic life. The life of families who took pride in a clean home, a tidy garden, a birthday party that felt special without costing a fortune. Wilko made that life easier. It made it more affordable. And in doing so, it made itself indispensable. The seasons marked themselves out in Wilko's aisles as clearly as they did anywhere in Britain. In February, the seed packets arrived, tomatoes, sweet peas, runner beans, and the garden section filled with compost and terracotta pots. In August, the back-to-school stationery appeared, pencil cases, ring binders, geometry sets, and flat tins. In October, the Halloween decorations took over an entire aisle. And then, from late September onwards, Christmas. The Christmas section in Wilko was something to behold. Tinsel in every color, baubles sold by the box, wrapping paper in rolls long enough to last the whole family, advent calendars, fairy lights, artificial snow, and aerosol cans. All of it priced so that no one had to choose between having a proper Christmas and paying the bills. For many families, particularly those on modest incomes, Wilko was where Christmas actually became possible. Not the luxury version, the real version, the one with enough decorations on the tree, enough wrapping paper under it, enough small surprises in the stockings, the version that children remember for the rest of their lives. That is not a small thing. The staff who worked in Wilko during those years speak about it in ways that are not entirely typical of retail employment. Long service was common. It was not unusual to find employees who had worked in the same store for 10, 15, 20 years. They knew where everything was. They knew the regulars by name. They knew which products were always running low and which displays needed straightening after the weekend rush. There was a culture inside Wilko, practical, no nonsense, quietly proud, that reflected the stores themselves. Not glamorous, not fashionable, but solid, reliable, and built on the understanding that the job was worth doing properly. For many people in smaller towns and cities, Wilko was not just a shop, it was a career, a community, a place where their working lives had meaning beyond the transaction at the till. What was it about that red logo, those narrow aisles, that slightly overwhelming smell of cleaning products and garden soil that made so many people feel at home? The answer, perhaps, is that Wilko never tried to be anything other than what it was. In a retail world that increasingly spoke the language of aspiration, that sold people not just products, but identities, lifestyles, versions of themselves they might one day become. Wilko spoke a different language entirely. It spoke the language of the present tense, of the life you were actually living, not the one you were trying to reach. There is a particular kind of loyalty that kind of honesty earns. Not the loyalty of excitement or novelty, the deeper kind. The kind built up over years of Saturday mornings and school term preparations and Christmas decorating sessions and quiet weekday errands. The kind that, when it is finally lost, leaves something that cannot easily be named and cannot easily be replaced. For most of its early life, Wilko was a Midlands business. Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Birmingham, the industrial heartland of England, where the original customer had always lived. Working towns, practical people, the kind of places where a shop that sold good value household goods without any fuss was not just welcome, it was needed. But by the late 1970s, something had changed in how Britain shopped. Car ownership was rising. New retail formats were appearing. The idea that a regional chain could stay regional indefinitely was becoming harder to sustain. The question was no longer whether Wilko would grow beyond the Midlands. The question was how. The answer, under Tony Wilkinson's leadership, was careful and deliberate. No dramatic announcements, no aggressive acquisition strategy, just a steady, methodical expansion. One new store at a time, always on the high street, always in a town center, always serving the same kind of customer that had walked through the original Leicester door in 1930. By the mid-1980s, Wilko had stores across northern England. By the 1990s, Wales and Scotland. By the early 2000s, the network stretched to over 300 locations and was still growing. The decision to stay on the high street, rather than follow competitors into out-of-town retail parks or shopping centers, was made consciously, and it was made repeatedly. It was, in many ways, an act of loyalty. Wilko's customers were not the customers who drove to a retail park on a Saturday afternoon and spent 3 hours browsing. They were the customers who walked to the shops, or took the bus, or parked in the town center car park for an hour to get what they needed and go home. Staying on the high street meant staying close to those people. It also meant something for the towns themselves. Wilko was not just a tenant. In dozens of smaller towns across Britain, it was one of the largest employers on the high street. It brought footfall. It kept neighboring businesses alive. When Wilko opened a new store in a town, the surrounding shops noticed the difference. There was a civic dimension to Wilko's presence that the company never made much noise about, but that communities felt directly. Unlike many retail chains of comparable size, Wilko never franchised. Every store was owned and operated by the company directly. There were no franchise agreements, no independent operators trading under the Wilko name, no variation in standards between one location and the next. That decision kept quality consistent. It kept the culture intact. And it meant that every member of staff in every store was a Wilko employee, trained the same way, paid through the same payroll, part of the same organization. It also meant something less comfortable. Every lease was Wilko's responsibility. Every store's performance, good or bad, sat on the company's own balance sheet. There was no buffer, no franchise owner to absorb a difficult year in a struggling town. When a high street declined, Wilko felt it directly. And as the years went on, more and more high streets were declining. The stores themselves evolved through the expansion years, though never dramatically. The original Wilko format, deep, narrow, packed with products, was adapted for larger sites as the chain grew, but the essential character remained. Bright lighting, functional layout, the same reliable categories in the same reliable places. Customers who moved to a new town and found a Wilko there knew immediately where the cleaning products would be, where the garden section was, where to find the batteries and the light bulbs. That predictability was a feature, not a limitation. New store openings in the 1990s and early 2000s were, by the standards of retail, unremarkable events. No celebrity appearances, no launch promotions. The doors opened, the shelves were stocked, and the customers came, because Wilko was Wilko, and they already knew what that meant. By the mid-2000s, Wilko employed more than 20,000 people across Britain. For many of them, particularly in smaller towns where large employers were scarce, Wilko was not simply a job. It was the job, stable, familiar, close to home. Staff turnover was low by retail standards. Managers who had started on the shop floor stayed for decades. There was a pride in the work that came not from any corporate culture program, but from something simpler. The sense that the shop mattered to the people who used it, and that the people who ran it were part of something worth running properly. That pride was real, and it was, in its quiet way, one of Wilko's greatest assets. It was also, in the years to come, one of the things that made what happened next so difficult to watch. 400 stores, tens of thousands of employees, a presence in almost every major town in England, Wales, and Scotland. On paper, it looked like strength, and for a long time it was. But 400 leases on 400 high streets, in a country where high street footfall was beginning, slowly and then quickly to fall, was not only an asset, it was also, though almost no one said it plainly at the time, a weight that only grew heavier with every passing year. There is a phrase that gets used about certain shops, certain brands, certain places that have been around long enough to stop being businesses and become something else entirely. Part of the furniture, it is not a glamorous phrase. It does not suggest excitement or innovation or the kind of energy that fills a business school case study, but it describes something real. The particular status that a handful of companies earn when they have been present, reliable, and unchanged for long enough that people stop noticing them consciously and simply absorb them into the texture of ordinary life. By the late 1990s, Wilko had become part of the furniture of Britain, not in every postcode, not in the wealthiest neighborhoods, where different shops served different needs, but across the working towns and mid-sized cities that make up the quiet majority of this country, in the places where people lived ordinary lives and needed ordinary things at ordinary prices, Wilko was simply there, week after week, year after year, generation after generation. That last word matters more than it might seem. The customers who had first walked into a Wilkinson store in the 1950s and 1960s had, by the 1990s, been bringing their children for decades. Those children were now bringing their own children. The habit of going to Wilko for the cleaning products, for the garden supplies, for the Christmas decorations, had been passed down not through any conscious decision, but through the simple repetition of family routine. A grandmother who had bought her curtain rails from Wilko in 1968 had a granddaughter buying storage boxes from the same chain in 2005. That is not brand loyalty in the way marketing departments mean it. That is something closer to cultural inheritance, the quiet transmission of habit and trust across time, the way certain songs or certain smells carry the weight of people who are no longer here. Very few retailers ever achieve it. Wilko had it, almost without trying. At its cultural peak, roughly the late 1990s through to the mid-2010s, Wilko occupied a specific and important place in British domestic life that is worth describing precisely. It was not aspirational, it never tried to be. At a time when retail was increasingly in the business of selling people a version of themselves they might one day become, Wilko sold them what they needed today. There was no lifestyle on offer, no mood board, no carefully curated aesthetic. Just shelves of useful things, clearly priced, reliably stocked. For millions of people, that was an enormous relief. The early 2000s were years in which British retail grew steadily more complicated, more choice, more noise, more pressure to spend more than was sensible on things that looked better than they needed to. Against that backdrop, Wilko's stubborn practicality felt almost countercultural. It was the shop that did not try to impress you. It simply served you, and people loved it for that. The own brand products that Wilko developed through this period deserve a particular mention. Wilko branded cleaning products, paint, stationery, pet food, garden tools, all of them designed to the same principle that had governed the business since 1930. Good enough to do the job properly, priced so that choosing them required no sacrifice and no justification. For households watching their budgets carefully, and in Britain, that has always been most households. Wilko's own brand range was not a compromise. It was a solution. The washing up liquid cleaned the dishes. The paint covered the walls. The birdseed filled the feeder. Nobody needed to feel embarrassed about buying it because there was nothing to be embarrassed about. It worked. It was honest. It cost what it should cost. When Wilko was at its strongest, it was also one of the more significant employers in dozens of British towns. Not the largest, not the most prestigious, but present, stable, and, crucially, local in a way that increasingly few large employers were. The manager of a Wilko in Doncaster or Swansea or Inverness was not a distant corporate figure. They were a member of the community. Their staff were neighbors, parents at the same schools, members of the same churches and clubs. That embeddedness gave Wilko a kind of civic weight that went beyond its commercial function. When the store did well, the high street around it felt it. When Wilko sponsored a local event or supported a community cause, as it regularly did quietly without much fanfare, the connection between the shop and the town it served became something mutual. Wilko needed its customers, and its customers, in ways they perhaps did not fully articulate, needed Wilko. Somewhere in Britain tonight, there is someone who remembers exactly what their local Wilko smelled like. The particular combination of cleaning products and garden soil and fresh plastic and something else, something harder to name, that hit you as the automatic doors opened and you walked in from the high street. They remember it the way people remember the smell of a grandparent's house or the inside of a school corridor on the first day of term. Not because it was beautiful, because it was theirs. That kind of memory is not manufactured. It cannot be bought or replicated or relaunched. It is simply what happens when something has been present and reliable and genuinely useful for long enough. And it was already, though almost no one knew it yet, beginning to run out of time. The trouble with a shop that never tries to surprise you is that it can change without you noticing. Not the shop itself, the world around it. For most of Wilko's history, the high street was simply where shopping happened. It was not a choice, or a preference, or a lifestyle statement. It was geography. You went to the high street because the high street was where the shops were, and the shops were where you went when you needed things. The logic was circular and complete, and it had been true for generations. By the mid-2000s, it was beginning to stop being true. The signs were not dramatic. They rarely are at first. A new retail park on the edge of town, a supermarket that had quietly expanded its non-food range, a few empty units appearing on the high street and staying empty a little longer than they used to. Nothing alarming on its own. Everything, in retrospect, pointing in the same direction. Wilko's leadership could see what was happening. The question was what to do about it, and how quickly. The answer, as it turned out, was not quickly enough. The first and most immediate competitive threat did not come from the internet. It came from shops that looked, on the surface, remarkably similar to Wilko. B&M Bargains had been growing steadily since the early 2000s. Home Bargains, owned by the Liverpool-based T.J. Morris, was expanding rapidly across the north of England and beyond. Poundland was opening new stores every month. All of them sold household essentials at low prices. All of them targeted broadly the same customer. All of them operated with cost structures that were, in various ways, leaner than Wilko's. B&M and Home Bargains, in particular, had made a different bet on location. Rather than anchoring themselves to high street leases, with their higher rents and their dependence on town center footfall, they moved into retail parks, former supermarket units, large out-of-town spaces where rents were lower and car parking was free and plentiful. It was not a more glamorous model, but it was a cheaper one, and in a market where price was everything, the difference mattered. Wilko watched this happen from its 400 high street locations and did not move. The second crack was quieter and in some ways more damaging. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, Wilko's investment in its stores, in the fabric of the buildings, the quality of the fit-out, the freshness of the displays, began to slow. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way these things always happen, gradually, almost invisibly, as budgets tightened and priorities shifted, and the decision to refurbish a store in a town where footfall was declining seemed harder to justify each year. But customers noticed, not consciously perhaps, not in a way that would have shown up clearly in a survey or a focus group, but the Wilko of 2012 felt, in many locations, slightly different from the Wilko of 2002. The edges were a little rougher, the lighting a little harsher, the sense of a shop being looked after, being invested in, being cared for, a little less present. For a brand whose entire proposition rested on reliability and trust, that erosion of the physical environment was not a cosmetic problem. It was a structural one. Online retail, meanwhile, was rewriting the rules of the entire industry. Amazon had launched in the United Kingdom in 1998. For the first decade, its impact on a shop like Wilko was limited. The products Wilko sold were not, for the most part, the kind of things people bought online in significant numbers. Household cleaning products, garden tools, Christmas decorations. The convenience of buying these things in a store, seeing them in person, taking them home the same day, still outweighed the convenience of ordering them and waiting. But that calculation was shifting. By the early 2010s, Amazon's delivery speeds had improved dramatically. Its product range had expanded to include almost everything Wilko stocked, and a new generation of shoppers, younger, more comfortable online, less attached to the ritual of the high street, was beginning to form its habits in a fundamentally different way. Wilko had a website. It had an online store. But the investment behind it was modest in the infrastructure to support genuine online scale. The warehousing, the logistics, the technology was not there in the way it needed to be. The company was, in this respect, fighting a new kind of war with the tools of an older one. What makes this period so difficult to assess looking back is that none of these problems were invisible to the people running Wilko. They knew about the discount competitors. They knew about the high street decline. They knew that online retail was growing and that their own digital capability was not keeping pace. The internal conversations happened. The strategic reviews were commissioned. The options were considered. But Wilko was a family business. And family businesses, even very large ones, operate with a particular kind of internal logic that is not always well suited to rapid, disruptive change. Decisions move more slowly. The instinct to protect what had been built, to preserve the character of the thing rather than reinvent it, was strong. That instinct had served the business well for 90 years. In the decade that followed, it would prove very difficult to escape. Could a different set of decisions made 10 years earlier have saved Wilko? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Retail is not a controlled experiment. The high street decline that damaged Wilko damaged hundreds of other businesses too. The rise of Amazon and the discount chains reshaped the entire sector, not just one company. But it is hard to look at the choices made during this period. The slow response to online competition, the failure to renegotiate the high street lease model, the underinvestment in the store estate, and not wonder what might have been different. The cracks were visible. They were not yet fatal. That distinction would not last much longer. In March 2020, the British government told the country to stay at home. For most retailers, the lockdown was a shock. For Wilko, it was something closer to a turning point. The moment when problems that had been manageable became problems that were not. The stores closed. The footfall that Wilko's entire business model depended upon simply stopped. Unlike the large supermarkets, which were permitted to remain open as essential retailers, Wilko occupied an ambiguous middle ground. Selling cleaning products and household essentials, yes, but also garden tools and stationery and Christmas decorations. It was not obviously essential in the way that food retail was. And in the early weeks of the pandemic, that ambiguity cost it dearly. Revenue fell. Fixed costs, the leases on 400 high street stores, the staffing, the logistics, Did not. The company furloughed thousands of staff under the government's coronavirus job retention scheme. It drew on its reserves. It did what businesses across Britain were doing. It survived month by month on the assumption that the other side of the pandemic would look something like the world before it. That assumption turned out to be wrong. The supply chain disruption that followed the pandemic was, for a business like Wilko, particularly damaging. Wilko sourced a significant proportion of its products from overseas manufacturers, primarily in Asia. The global disruption to shipping, to manufacturing capacity, to the movement of goods across borders hit those supply lines hard. Products that should have arrived in autumn 2021 arrived late, or in reduced quantities or not at all. For a retailer whose customers came through the door expecting to find the same products in the same places every single week, empty shelves were not merely an inconvenience. They were a breach of the fundamental promise that Wilko had been making to its customers for 90 years. People came in for the own brand cleaning spray and found the shelf bare. They came back the following week and found it bare again. After a while, some of them stopped coming back at all. The habits that had taken decades to build began, quietly, to break. By 2022, the financial picture at Wilko had become serious. The company had absorbed the losses of the pandemic years. It had navigated, imperfectly, the supply chain crisis. But the cumulative damage to its cash position was significant, and the trading environment it found itself in as the country emerged from COVID was not the one it had been hoping for. Inflation was rising sharply. The cost of living crisis was squeezing the spending power of exactly the customers Wilko served. Working families, people on modest incomes, households watching every pound. In theory, a shop that sold affordable household essentials should have been well placed for that moment. In practice, Wilko was losing those customers to B&M and Home Bargains, competitors whose lower operating costs allowed them to price even more aggressively in stores that were often larger, better stocked, and easier to reach by car. The margin for error that Wilko had once had was gone, and the leadership knew it. In the spring of 2022, Wilko began looking for outside investment. The search was not publicized. It was conducted quietly through advisors in the way that family businesses tend to handle these things, with a strong preference for discretion and a strong reluctance to acknowledge publicly that the situation had become urgent. Several potential investors were approached. Conversations were held. Numbers were exchanged. Nothing came of it. The difficulty was structural. Wilko's model, 400 high street stores, all directly operated, all on long leases, was not an attractive proposition for financial investors in 2022. The high street was in managed decline. The leases represented liabilities as much as assets. Any investor taking on Wilko was taking on not just a business, but a vast and complicated real estate problem, at a moment when the appetite for exactly that kind of risk was close to zero. Private equity firms, which had restructured and in many cases destroyed other beloved British retailers in the preceding decade, were not interested. The numbers did not work, and the Wilkinson family, who retained control of the business, faced a choice that had no good options. There is something important to understand about why Wilko did not pursue a more radical restructuring earlier. A managed reduction in the store estate, a genuine pivot to online, a renegotiation of lease terms before the crisis became acute. The family's caution was not simply inertia. It was in large part a deliberate choice rooted in something real. They had watched what private equity had done to other retailers. Toys R Us, Debenhams, BHS. The pattern was familiar. A leveraged buyout, followed by debt loading, followed by sale-leaseback arrangements that stripped the property assets, followed by collapse, followed by thousands of redundancies and gutted pension funds. The Wilkinson family did not want that for their business. They did not want to sell to investors whose primary interest was extraction rather than preservation. They wanted to protect the people who worked for them, the communities that depended on them, the thing that their grandfather had built. That instinct was honorable. It was also, by the time it became clear that outside capital was unavoidable, too late to act upon effectively. The people who worked on the shop floor during this period describe an atmosphere that shifted, slowly and then quickly, from uncertainty to dread. Rumors had circulated in Wilko for years that the company was struggling, that changes were coming, that things were not as stable as the familiar red signage suggested. Most employees had learned to discount them. Wilko had always been there. It was hard to imagine it not being there. But in 2022 and into 2023, something changed. The rumors became more specific. The denials from head office became less convincing. Products that had always been in stock began disappearing from the shelves and not coming back. Hours were cut. Small signals accumulated into something that could not be dismissed. Long-serving employees, people who had given 15, 20 years to the company, began to understand with a quiet and terrible clarity what was coming. And who exactly was supposed to protect them? The workers who had turned up every day for decades and kept the shelves stocked and the doors open and the customers served. When the people at the top had run out of options, that question did not have a good answer. By early 2023, Wilko was in the final chapter of a story that had taken years to write and would take only months to finish. The family had not given up. Advisors were still working. Potential buyers were still being contacted. The possibility of a rescue, partial or complete, was still, just barely, alive. But the window was closing. 400 stores, 12,500 employees, 93 years of history, and a balance sheet that could no longer support the weight of any of it. On the 3rd of August 2023, Wilko confirmed what many of its employees had spent months quietly dreading. The company had appointed PricewaterhouseCoopers as administrator. The announcement was made in the morning. By lunchtime, it was the lead story on every major British news outlet. By the afternoon, it was being discussed in Parliament. By the evening, the photographs had begun to appear on social media, staff standing outside their stores, some in tears, some simply standing very still, as though trying to absorb something that did not yet feel entirely real. For the people inside those stores, the news had arrived in the worst possible way. Not through a formal staff briefing, not through a letter or a meeting with a manager, through their phones, through text messages from friends and family who had seen it on the news, through notifications from BBC News and Sky News and The Guardian, arriving on the same devices they used to check the weather and message their children. 12,500 people found out that their jobs were gone, or likely gone, from the same place they found out about everything else. The internet, a push notification, a few seconds of text on a screen. That detail matters. It says something about the distance between the people who make decisions in business and the people who live with the consequences of those decisions. The weeks that followed were, by any measure, extraordinary to watch. PricewaterhouseCoopers moved quickly to find buyers for the business, or for parts of it. The preference, he stated publicly, was for a rescue deal that would preserve as many jobs as possible. The reality, as potential buyers looked at the numbers and the lease obligations and the state of the high street, was that no one wanted to take on the whole thing. Poundland expressed interest in acquiring a number of stores, enough to save perhaps 2,000 jobs. Negotiations continued for several weeks. They ultimately came to nothing. The Range, a discount retailer based in Plymouth, made an offer for the Wilko brand name and its intellectual property. Not the stores, not the staff, not the leases or the supplier relationships or the logistics infrastructure, just the name. The name that James Kempsey Wilkinson had attached to a small shop on Charnwood Street in Leicester in 1930. It was sold for a sum that was not disclosed. The store closures began in late August and continued through September and into October. They did not happen all at once. That in some ways made it harder. Each week brought a new list. 20 stores closing, then 30, then another batch the week after. Employees received letters telling them their location's closing date. Some had a few weeks' notice, some had less. The process had a rhythm to it, methodical, administrative, entirely without sentiment, that sat in painful contrast to the human reality of what was happening inside each of those buildings. Staff who had worked in the same store for a decade came in for their final shifts and found customers they had served hundreds of times, coming in not because they needed anything in particular, but because they wanted to be there, to market, to say something however quietly about what the place had meant. Queues formed outside some stores on their final days. Not the queues of a closing down sale, though there were those too, as liquidators moved through the estate marking everything down, but a different kind of queue, patient, subdued. The queue of people who understood that something was ending and felt in some way they could not quite articulate that they should be present for it. The liquidation itself was difficult to witness. Anyone who visited a Wilko in its final weeks saw something that felt wrong in a way that went beyond the practical inconvenience of finding the shelves half empty. The products that remained, reduced to clear, stickered with yellow tags, arranged in the dwindling order of a shop in its last days, were the same products that had been there for years. The own brand cleaning spray, the garden tools, the stationery, the pet supplies, all of it suddenly marked down, suddenly provisional, suddenly belonging to a category of things that were no longer being replenished or cared for. The red Wilko branding was still on the walls. The layout was still the same, but the feeling had changed entirely, from a place that was maintained and purposeful to a place that was being emptied. Retail workers understand this feeling. They have a name for it. They call it the death of a store. And anyone who walked through a Wilko in September 2023 knew, without being told, that that was precisely what they were watching. The human cost of the collapse was not abstract. 12,500 people. That number appeared in every news report, every parliamentary statement, every trade union press release. It is a number large enough to be significant and small enough to be ignored. Too big to fully imagine, too small to compete with the scale of numbers that dominate economic headlines. But behind that number were individual stories of a particular kind of loss. The woman in her 50s who had worked at the same Wilko for 18 years, who had started on the shop floor, worked her way up to assistant manager, and now found herself at an age when starting again is genuinely difficult, without a job and without the pension contributions she had been counting on. The young man who had taken the job straight from school and stayed because the environment suited him, structured, familiar, uncomplicated, and who now faced a job market that rewarded exactly the kind of flexibility and adaptability that he had never needed to develop. The store manager who had given the best years of her working life to a company that she had genuinely believed in, and who stood outside on the last day and shook hands with every member of her team as they left because there was nothing else left to do. These stories did not make the front pages. They did not trend on social media. But they were happening in real towns, to real people, in their hundreds and then their thousands, throughout that long and difficult autumn. The high streets that Wilko left behind told their own story. In town after town across Britain, the closure left a gap that was physical as much as commercial. Wilko had often occupied large prominent units, corner sites, former department stores, the kind of spaces that define the character of a high street simply by their size and position. Those spaces did not fill quickly. Some remained empty for months. A few were still empty a year later. In smaller towns, places where Wilko had been one of the last major retailers still trading on the high street, the closure accelerated a decline that was already underway, removing the footfall that had kept neighboring businesses alive and leaving behind a stretch of shuttered windows that said something bleak, inaccurate about the state of British town centers. The anchor was gone, and without the anchor, the surrounding shops felt the pull. The media coverage of the collapse was, by the standards of retail news, unusually emotional. Television reporters stood outside closing stores and spoke to customers in a register that was more suited to the closure of a hospital than the administration of a retail chain. Newspaper columnists wrote about what Wilko had meant to their families, their childhoods, their sense of what a British town center was supposed to feel like. On social media, the reaction was immediate and sustained. Photographs of final visits, tributes to individual stores, memories shared by people who had worked there, shopped there, grown up there. The hashtag carried a weight that purely commercial stories rarely accumulate. The weight of genuine public grief, however unfashionable that word might seem in this context. Britain does not tend to mourn its shops. It is not that kind of country. But it mourned Wilko. The last Wilko store closed in October 2023. There was no ceremony, no official marking of the occasion. The administrator's job was to close the estate as efficiently as possible, and that job was done. The red signage came down, the shelves were cleared, the doors were locked. 93 years, 400 stores, 12,500 people, gone in less than 90 days. What remains of a shop when the shop is gone? The buildings remain, empty or repurposed or already let to someone else. The products remain, still manufactured, still sold, under different names and in different places. The brand name remains purchased by the range, waiting to be reattached to something that will not be Wilko, whatever it is called. But the thing itself, the particular combination of place and people and habit and trust that had been built up slowly and without fanfare across nearly a century of British life, that is gone. And the people who knew it best understood, as they walked away from those locked doors for the last time, that it was not coming back. When the last Wilko store closed in October 2023, the question that remained, the one that nobody in the retail industry, or in government, or in the communities that had depended on Wilko for decades, could quite bring themselves to answer directly, was a simple one. What comes next? The honest answer, in most cases, was not very much. The range had purchased the Wilko brand name. Within months, Wilko branded products began appearing on the range's website. Own label cleaning products, household essentials, the kind of practical goods that had defined the original business. The name was back. The prices were recognizable. The logo was familiar. But the range is not Wilko. It is a different kind of retailer. Larger format, more varied in its product mix, oriented primarily around its own store estate and its online operation. The Wilko name in the range's hands is a label attached to a product range, not a presence on a high street. There are no Wilko stores. There are no Wilko employees. There is no Wilko in the sense that 12,500 people and millions of customers had understood for the better part of a century. The brand survived. The business did not. The competitors who had spent years chipping away at Wilko's customer base moved quickly to fill the space it left. B&M opened new stores. Home Bargains accelerated its expansion program. Poundland increased its range of household products. All of them understood that Wilko's collapse had released a significant pool of customers, habitual, practical, value-conscious shoppers who needed somewhere else to go, and all of them wanted those customers. In many towns, the transition happened faster than anyone had expected. Within 6 months of a Wilko closing, a B&M or a Home Bargains had often appeared nearby. Not in the same unit, which was typically too large or too centrally located for their model, but close enough to capture the displaced footfall. For customers, the practical gap was, in time, partially filled. For the high streets themselves, it was not. The units that Wilko had occupied, large, prominent, centrally located, proved extremely difficult to relet. Discount retailers preferred retail parks. Supermarkets already had their own estates. Independent retailers could not afford the rents on spaces designed for national chains. Local authorities, already stretched, did not have the resources to repurpose large vacant units into community spaces or cultural venues, even when the will to do so existed. In some towns, the empty Wilko unit became a symbol, visible, unavoidable, impossible to ignore, of everything that had gone wrong with the British high street over the preceding 2 decades. A large dark shop front in the middle of town, with the ghost of red branding still faintly visible through the boarding. It is still there, in more towns than it should be today. For the 12,500 people who lost their jobs, the aftermath was as varied as the people themselves. Younger employees, particularly those in larger towns and cities, found work relatively quickly. In supermarkets, in other retail chains, in warehouses and logistics operations that were, ironically, part of the online retail infrastructure that had contributed to Wilko's decline. Older employees, particularly those in smaller towns, Those who had spent 15 or 20 years with the company, those whose skills and experience were specific to a kind of retail that was itself in decline, had a harder time. The redundancy payments were, for many, insufficient. Long service at Wilko had not translated into the kind of financial security that might have cushioned the transition. Some employees lost pension contributions they had been counting on. Others found that the reference of a long Wilko career, once a mark of stability and reliability, carried less weight in a job market that prized adaptability and digital literacy above all else. The human cost of the collapse was not confined to the day the stores closed. It continued quietly and without headlines for months and years afterwards. The broader lesson that the retail industry took from Wilko's collapse was one that had been available for at least a decade before anyone was forced to learn it. A business built entirely on physical presence, on the footfall of high streets, on the habits of customers who came in because the shop was there and had always been there, is not a business with a sustainable future in a world where those habits are changing and that footfall is declining. That is not a complicated insight. It was available to anyone who looked clearly at what was happening to British retail from the mid-2000s onwards. The difficulty was not the diagnosis. The difficulty was the courage and the capital to act on it before the crisis made action impossible. Wilko was not the first British retailer to learn that lesson too late. It will not be the last. What do we lose when the places that held our ordinary lives together disappear, not because they failed us, but because the world changed faster than they could follow? That question does not have a clean answer, but it is worth sitting with, because what replaces a shop like Wilko on the high street, in the community, in the weekly rhythm of ordinary life, is not always something. Sometimes it is simply the absence of something that used to be there. And absences, unlike shops, do not announce themselves when they open. They are simply felt gradually by the people who remember what used to be in their place. Picture a Saturday morning in an ordinary British town, not a famous town, not a town that appears in travel guides or on postcards, just a town with a car park behind the high street and a row of shops that have been there long enough to feel permanent, and a particular quality of gray morning light that belongs to no other country on earth. A parent and a child walk through the automatic doors. The smell hits first, that specific, unmistakable combination of cleaning products in garden soil and fresh plastic that existed nowhere else in quite the same way. The lighting is bright and functional. The aisles are narrow. The trolleys are slightly awkward. There is a woman blocking the household section with a very large basket, studying two different sizes of washing powder with the focused attention of someone making a decision that genuinely matters. The child looks up at the shelves, row after row of things that mean nothing to a child and everything to the adult beside them. Light bulbs, mop heads, bin liners. The small, necessary, completely unglamorous infrastructure of a life being lived properly and carefully. They find what they came for. They add a few things they did not come for, but are glad to have found. They pay at the till, take the red carrier bag, and walk back out into the gray morning. Nothing remarkable happened. Nothing was supposed to. That was the whole point. It would be easy to describe what Wilko sold and stop there. Household goods, cleaning products, garden supplies, party decorations, the practical miscellany of domestic life, priced for people who could not afford to be careless with money. But that description, accurate as it is, misses the thing that actually mattered. What Wilko sold, beneath all of it, was a particular kind of dignity. The dignity of being able to walk into a shop and afford what was on the shelves without having to calculate, to compromise, to put something back. The dignity of a Christmas that looked like Christmas, with enough decorations, enough wrapping paper, enough small surprises, without requiring a debt that would last into February. The dignity of a clean home, an attended garden, and a child with the right stationery on the first day of term, regardless of what the household income happened to be. These are not small things. In the lives of working families, in the lives of people managing on modest incomes in a country that has never found it easy to talk honestly about what modest incomes actually mean, these things are not small at all. Wilko understood that. not as a marketing strategy, not as a brand positioning, simply as a fact of the world it existed in and the people it existed for. That understanding, quiet, practical, entirely without sentimentality, was what made the shop more than a shop. It was what made it, for millions of people across 4 decades, a place that belonged to them. Not to shareholders, not to a brand consultant's vision board. To them. The grandmother who bought her curtain rails there in 1972 and the granddaughter who bought her storage boxes there in 2019 were not brand loyalists in any meaningful commercial sense. They were people who had found a place that treated them with straightforward respect and who came back because that is what people do when they find such a place. Wilko never asked for their loyalty. It earned it, slowly, without fanfare, over the course of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, repeated thousands of times across nearly a century. The people who built Wilko, from James Kemsey Wilkinson on a quiet street in Leicester in 1930, through 4 generations of a family that tried, until the very end, to protect what they had made, deserved a better ending than the one they got. The people who worked there, the managers and the shop floor staff and the warehouse workers and the buyers and the drivers and everyone else who turned up year after year and kept the thing running, deserved more than a push notification telling them it was over. The customers who had simply relied on it, without drama or declaration, as part of the ordinary furniture of their lives, they deserved to have it still be there. None of that happened, and no amount of reflection changes it. But this much can be said, and said plainly. For 93 years, in hundreds of towns across Britain, there was a shop that understood what ordinary life actually costs and decided to make it a little more manageable. That did not ask its customers to aspire to anything other than what they already were. That employed tens of thousands of people and paid them honestly and gave them somewhere worth going to work. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing Wilko to a person who never knew it, trying to explain what it was, why it mattered, why its absence is felt in ways that are difficult to put into words. The person listening will not fully understand. They cannot, but they will understand from the way it is described that something real was there, something that belonged to the people who used it, and that it is gone now, and that it is missed.